Well, finally, we got a movie some of you may have heard of. This is Escape from New York on VHS. Crazy.
Hello? Popcorn delivery.
Put a little weekend in your week. Rent a video.
Escape from New York, just from the cover alone, you can tell it's a really kick-ass, badass movie. You got the Statue of Liberty's head in the streets, which disappointingly never happens during the movie. The Statue of Liberty is intact. It's not just in the street somewhere, although that would be really cool. And this is the second most well-known use of the Statue of Liberty, an iconic film image after Planet of the Apes, of course.
Here's something off the request line.
Which they may have been going for, I don't know. But yeah, that's not in the movie. Kind of deceptive advertising, but we got Kurt Russell here, and he's, I guess, got a snake tattoo on his left arm. He's standing there looking at the camera. Man, oh man, what a badass. Now, like I said in my Tombstone review, Kurt Russell is a very wholesome actor. You can't help but like him when he's on screen. I like R.J. McCready, a fun character. So it's really interesting to see the same director with Kurt Russell in a different joint, this being for some reason Escape from LA and Escape from New York are considered different genres. Escape from LA is considered post-apocalyptic. I'd say they're both about the same. Semi-post-apocalyptic, but mainly they're cyberpunk. They're very cyberpunk movies. This is like second-rate Blade Runner. It's not the best cyberpunk film, but it is one of the best. It's like the second best cyberpunk film. It's like a runner-up. Snake Plissken is a really great character. He has a lot of charm. He has a lot of, you know, he's this giant snarky asshole, but you just can't help but like him because, you know, he's frickin' Kurt Russell. And I think that's really interesting. And of course, this is before the thing, actually. So before this, Kurt Russell was only in Disney comedies. So he wanted to portray this big badass with this crazy, you know, eye patch, and he's practically a freaking pirate, and he's got all this stubble, and he's carrying around this big-ass gun, and, I don't know, do I buy it? Yeah, I guess I do. But he's freaking Kurt Russell, you know, he's the most wholesome hunk alive. Like, you take Patrick Swayze, you know, he's just a straight hunk. But Kurt Russell is a freaking wholesome hunk, so I don't know, maybe... You know, like R.J. McCready isn't a badass, really. He's a very realistic character. But man, Snake Plissken, Kurt Russell does bring a lot of charm to the role, I will say.
I don't give a fuck.
You know, a lot of the effects in this movie were created using really the whole time I thought I was looking at a set. Because it just looks so good, and I thought, wow, you know, John Carpenter can really do some crazy, amazing things with sets and props, and just make the whole thing look really good and realistic. There's one scene that's shot, or set on Liberty Island, and I thought they built a big Statue of Liberty model, like in Planet of the Apes, and just had actors standing under it, and it was all on a soundstage, but it's actually the Statue of Liberty, and John Carpenter and his crew actually told the city of New York that they were going to take 10 blocks at a time. They'd like film on 10 blocks. They just rent it out, and like I can only imagine what that must have been like to, you know, graffiti the whole place up and put all this rubble and trash fires everywhere, and then clear it out, like, and in New York, you know, like, where there's so much traffic, it's absolutely insane to think that New York would just let John Carpenter do this, but he was the guy behind Halloween. I think as time goes on, you know, from his initial success with Halloween, this very grounded, low-budget feature. You see him start to implement more and more cool props and sets and just go crazy with the practical stuff like in The Thing. And this is another example of John Carpenter absolutely spending his budget right. It may have been hella expensive to rent like 10 blocks of New York, but they use it correctly, so, who cares? It looks amazing. Now, admittedly, some parts were filmed in Los Angeles on a soundstage, but most of it looks realistic. It looks good. There are a few scenes with miniatures, I think, which is a very cool idea, and it does look really good. The whole movie is very cliche. It's just one big cliche after another, but you have to keep in mind, and the whole time you're watching it, you don't notice the cliches, because this is a formative film for the genre. Snake Plissken is the progenitor of all the eye-patched badasses that followed in his wake, the same way Rick Deckard is a progenitor of all the introspective private eyes that followed in his wake. Two sides of the cyberpunk coin, one is this, Rick Deckard, one is Snake Plissken. Snake Plissken, or whatever. They really ought to make a crossover between the two. That'd be very interesting. In comic form, maybe, But, and of course we got the excellent photography by Dean Cundey. Not a John Carpenter movie without Dean Cundey. I find it crazy how, they have some really cool effects in here. Like, for instance, there's one bit where Kurt Russell is flying over New York, and there's a graphic on his screen of like a 3D rendering of New York. And at that time, it was 1981, a 3D rendering of New York was pretty much impossible, or like very, very expensive. So what they did is they got some glow-in-the-dark tape and affixed this to the edges of all the buildings in their little New York miniature, and then filmed that. And the effect looks so good. Like, it probably looks better than an actual computer 3D rendering could, because it looks so bright and alive, and the graphics are just really good. This movie is full of like just very smart little special effects like that, and you kind of wonder like, how the heck did they do this? How'd they pull this off? Just so much set dressing, such attention to detail. All the areas feel real and alive, and it's like, whoa, But it's really good. Another cliche I kind of noticed with this film is that all the characters have these very descriptive titles, that being, the smart one is the brain, the one that drives the cab is the cabbie, the one that's the president is just the president. We never know his name, he's just the president. It's just this movie is 1981, so obviously, early 80s, but this movie is like so 80s. There's not a scrap of 70s in this thing. This could have been made in like 85, and I wouldn't even know. But this movie is just very ahead of its time. This movie understands the coming decade that's to come. You got all these punks and all this stuff, and it's often said that the early and late parts of a decade are less definitive than the midst of them. And I would agree with that. You go back to like 81, you'll still see some people wearing mod fashion. There's none of that in here. This is an 80s film. And I think that's just another example of how John Carpenter kind of crafted the world around him in very subtle ways. Like, maybe he didn't predict the 80s, maybe the 80s were influenced by this movie, which is pretty crazy to think about. Of course, the plot is that 5 years after this movie was made, 1986, The entirety of Manhattan Island is made into a walled prison. The movie itself is set in 1997, 11 years after that. Now, I would say that, unlike many filmmakers, John Carpenter does do a good job of understanding that as time passes, trends and attitudes do change. I find in a lot of futuristic 20th century movies, they don't really seem to understand that, styles and stuff change. So John Carpenter really tries to come up with a 90s aesthetic with this, which is refreshing, but it's more like the 80s. But it's pretty futuristic, so it is kind of like the 90s, but mostly it's like the 80s, but he does try to see 20 years ahead, or not quite 20 years, like 16 years ahead, and, he does a good job of kind of predicting this kind of stuff, lots of computers, lots of microprocessors, all this stuff. He sees the cyberpunk future, as it were. I really like that. It's not the most accurate movie if you're looking for hard science fiction, but it does have a lot of stuff that you would technically see in the 90s, so I will give him that. Obviously, the most glaring error isn't even that New York is a giant walled prison. The most glaring error is that the Soviet Union still exists in 1997 and the Cold War is still going on. So obviously John Carpenter didn't have the foresight to imagine a world where the Cold War ended because the Soviet Union was inefficient and didn't know how to perpetuate it so. But that's beside the point. This is a good movie. Now some people, particularly New Yorkers, might, this movie might hold a lot of stakes for them because they see the city they know and love turned into this giant battleground with fires and shooting everywhere, but I've never been to New York, so I don't really care about it, and I do consider it probably the most useless city on the face of the earth. So I do find the premise of making it a giant walled prison, it wouldn't change New York that much. They're already the crappiest city around, so to make it a giant walled prison is, it is a plausible thing, and to. So as far as premises go, I don't find making New York a giant prison too implausible in the long run. I think the premise of Escape from LA is a lot less plausible, which is why it was kind of scrapped, but I can definitely see, and it would make sense too, because New York is really overpopulated, so to tell all the current New York citizens to move somewhere else, because America is a giant-ass country, and, go somewhere else, and you can make use of all those buildings and skyscrapers and stuff. So, it does have a plausible deal behind it. I do think, what with the fetish Americans seem to have for New York, odds are it wouldn't happen, but it is a nice little fantasy to think that New York's relevance and importance on the world stage would be cut down to size, given just how much it contributes to the world at large. It's not that great a city. It's nowhere near as cool as it's chalked up to be. And, this New York actually has a lot more flavor and panache than the real New York, so I like that. What else is there? I'd say my favorite character is definitely, Ernest Borgnine. He's cabby. I find the idea of this senile old cab driver who continues driving his cab around New York even though the city is a shambles is just very endearing and heartfelt. And Ernest Borgnine brings a lot to the role. Initially, you just see him in a theater and you think it's just going to be a little cameo, but he's there for the whole movie, oddly enough.
What a sight, Snake. The whole camp rolling right across the bridge.
This is a very weird movie. I'd even go so far as to say it's as weird as Big Trouble in Little China, which of course John Carpenter also directs and Russell stars in. They do share a lot in common. I might suggest the two as a double feature. if you're feeling spicy. Escape from New York, of course, being the more iconic and well-remembered of the two, while Big Trouble in Little China has gone on as a cult classic. I find it strange that anyone with Carpenter's expertise could have any cult classics under his belt. You'd think every single movie John Carpenter put out would be a bona fide smash hit. He certainly has his own directorial style. I will say that Dean Cundey definitely contributes a lot to that. But there is a such thing as a Carpenter film. Carpenter films are very recognizable in aesthetic and style. Pretty much everything you can name about, any other director, Kubrick, Hitchcock, Tarantino. Carpenter has his own signature sauce, and it's definitely present in this. The guy who plays the Duke of New York is a very nice antagonist. He's very fun. He has chandeliers on his car, just fun stuff, And I don't know, it's kind of about racism, because you've got this very white establishment, and Kurt Russell feels kind of guilty the whole time because he's working for this white establishment, and the president really isn't that appealing. He's turned the entire city of New York into this giant prison compound. And then you have the Duke, who's just a very sympathetic villain because, he is fighting for what he believes is right, and he's oppressed. And I think it's very bold of John Carpenter to have the Duke be a black guy. It is very obvious. It's not overt, but it does say something about the condition of the state of the United States in this film. It's very provocative for '81. I will say. And the Duke really brings all that charisma and character, and I like the chandeliers on his car. That's a nice touch. And of course, the most iconic scene is where Kurt Russell is pitted against a giant brute, and they're forced to duke it out. And I see a lot of similar, motifs pop up in all kinds of stuff, like Magnus Robot Fighter, and that's a very common trope. The little hero against the big Goliath. It happens so much. It's a very common trope. But I do like that. Obviously, they try and pack every scene with as much interesting stuff. It says, it sets the screen ablaze with heart-stopping suspense, outrageous stunts, and imaginative special effects. And I can definitely say without a doubt, these are some of the most imaginative special effects I've ever seen. They were so good, I thought John Carpenter had just made an entire set. And then I realized, no, this is actually New York, which, I don't know. Could John Carpenter build an entire New York set if he had enough money? Probably. And it would look a lot better than the fake Hollywood Boulevard in 1941. Gosh darn, why do I keep referencing 1941 in all these VHS crazy reviews? But that said, there were a lot of imitators. Particularly of note, there is Escape 2000, which I know from an MST3K episode. There's an MST3K episode of Escape 2000. I guess that's the English title or the Italian title or something. It's a very weird Italian movie. It deals with just the Bronx being made this war-torn ghetto, whereas the rest of New York stays intact.
You are ordered to leave the Bronx. I repeat, you are ordered to leave the Bronx. The area...
And I think they're definitely trying to capitalize on the success of Escape from New York, with the title even, Escape 2000. Just very interesting to see B-movies popping out of B-movies. I don't know if you'd consider this a B-movie. I probably wouldn't. It's definitely an A film all around. The star-studded cast, Terry Dean Stanton and Donald Pleasance. But, Escape 2000 is definitely an interesting movie to watch if you want to know the kind of impact this film left on the whole post-apocalyptic sci-fi cyberpunk scene as a whole. I would go so far as to claim that Snake Plissken is an even funner hero than Mad Max. Like, you know, for all it's worth, he is still Mel Gibson, and Mel Gibson just doesn't pack the kind of charm that Kurt Russell can. Mad Max is okay, but, you know, I always gotta go with Snake Plissken. He's just fun, you know. Mad Max isn't that fun. He's too serious. He's got, you know, his wife and his kid to worry about, and he's revenge, you know. What's really great about Snake Plissken is that he's just a complete nihilist. He doesn't give a shit, and, you know, that's a fun character. I like that. He's a complete just hard ass with, like, no tolerance for anything. It's great.
I don't give a fuck.
I'd say this movie stands as the beginning of 80s dystopia science fiction, kinda. 70s dystopias are really weird and really out there, and odds are nobody in the modern era could even slightly identify with them. Like, I watched Death Race 2000, I watched Rollerball, and I think, what were the people in the 70s even thinking? Because I think in the 70s, you know, you had the OPEC crisis and the hostage crisis and all these crises, and people were so caught up in the moment with the 70s that they lacked foresight and they lacked the ability to think ahead. So all these 70s dystopias, Death Race 2000 and Rollerball, come to mind. They're just very much like the 70s, but with computers. And the 70s already had computers pretty much, so it's just like an upgraded 70s. It's not like later.
All right. This is Junior Bruce, your buddy and mine.
But like I said, in this movie, you do feel like John Carpenter was trying to make the 90s in 81, which is very interesting. This is the beginning of, I'd even go so far as to say, this is the genesis of modern post-apocalypse dystopian type film. Although I wouldn't categorize it as an entirely dystopian film. It, you know, the only idea is that New York is this giant prison, which isn't so bad, all things considered. I mean, in Judge Dredd, you know, all you got is the East Coast, and then the rest is just this toxic desert, so that's a lot worse, you know, all things considered. This is just kind of an interesting premise, and it is a very weird premise, because you kind of wonder, well, you know, Americans frickin' love New York like they love frickin' hamburgers and apple pie. Like, why would they turn the Statue of Liberty and the Twin Towers and the World Trade Center? And the World Trade Center is in this movie a lot, so I assume it's one of those movies that people assume, oh shit, it's time travel or something, because the World Trade Center is in it. And at one point there's even this bit where the President, Air Force One, is heading towards the Twin Towers, and it's just like, man, oh man, you know. But people say that about Die Hard, The Towering Inferno, any movie with airplanes in a big building, you know, they'll say, oh, it predicted 9/11. It didn't. The World Trade Center back then was as iconic a symbol of New York as the Statue of Liberty. They were two big buildings, and America was like, oh dang, it's two big buildings, I gotta get me this on a shirt and a hat. And everyone was wearing all this World Trade Center memorabilia around, thinking like, oh man, New York is just the best. I freaking love New York. I can't get enough of the Big Apple, am I right? But yeah, this movie is very interesting in that you gotta wonder, like, how did America let go of New York? How the heck did New York say, oh, we don't need this giant frickin' city? You know, we can spread out a little. Some would consider this a dystopia. I personally consider it a utopia. I think the world would be a lot better without New York. Given the kind of xenophobia and nationalism America is portrayed as having in this movie, the kind of phony diplomacy, you know, with the president and everything, I do wonder how America let go of New York so easily and decided to turn it into this giant prison. But at any rate, I do think New York is a better location for a mega prison than somewhere like Texas, which is portrayed as being this prison, or part of Texas, I guess, in this awful post-apocalyptic movie The Bad Batch, where Jim Carrey plays a hermit. Like, you know, Texas, no, you wouldn't turn that into a prison because there's no buildings or food or anything. But in New York, you know, they got enough resources to probably last a lifetime, so that's kind of interesting. Just put all the prisoners in there, let them play it out, let them figure their own problems out while the outside world functions as normal. Very interesting premise. And like I said, Snake Plissken is a really nice hero. He's not a hero, he's just a badass. I wouldn't even say he's an anti-hero, he's just a guy. Although, he's not just a guy in the same way R.J. McCready is a guy. He's a guy. He's a guy's guy. So, really good movie, really good stuff. And an all-star cast and an all-star crew. And, you know, Dean Cundey, John Carpenter, you can't go wrong with them. I didn't think I'd like this movie as much. I'm not much into dystopias and crap. You know, I hate The Maze Runner, I hate The Hunger Games, I hate Divergent. But this is admittedly a dystopian movie where, you know, it's not for young adults. This is for adults. This isn't YA, it's just A. None of that Katniss Evergreen garbage, none of that, oh, I'm divergent, or I'm convergent, or I'm this kind of virgin. It's just Snake Plissken going around shooting things up, car chases, plane chases, whatever kind of chases. This is an action film for action-minded individuals, and it's also, it does try to comment on society, and I would say it does a lot better job of commenting on society than something like Face Off. This is a social commentary movie, and it accomplishes what it's going for. This is a good solid 1 hour 39 minutes. It's pretty short. Apparently there was a scene cut where you get to see Snake Plissken committing a crime, and that's why he's brought in and given the deal, but that was cut. I do agree with that decision. I don't think we really needed to see what Plissken did, so long as we know he's a big criminal. This movie has a really funny running gag where everyone says again and again, "Hey, Plissken, I thought you were dead." And you wonder, like, how is Plissken such a big celebrity in this cut-off prison, you know, where everyone is isolated? Like, how do they all know about Plissken? And how have they all heard this rumor that he was dead, especially since he wasn't even in there? Just very interesting. A lot of fun. Excellent choreography. Now, of course, there is a soundtrack to this movie. I've listened to it, and early in the 2000s, the soundtrack was actually expanded to include some tracks that some of them don't even sound like they were in the movie. My personal favorite it's got to be a Snake Shake. I believe it's at the end of the soundtrack, and it just sounds epic. You know, it's this nice rockin' and rollin' synth wave, but there's also a song called Everybody's Coming to New York, which is like this show tune, and it's actually written by the guy who played Michael Myers, and I just find that very interesting. It kind of cuts into the soundtrack. You got all this synth wave, and then you got this weird, you know, this weird post-apocalyptic show tune, which in the movie is sung at this theater, which, you know, they've made for entertainment purposes. They put on a little show. It's very nice. It's a very nice, well-rounded soundtrack. And it's distinctly John Carpenter, you know. There's one point in the film at which this very spooky synth line plays, and it does sound like something from Halloween. In fact, it sounds almost identical to the Halloween theme. So that's just very cool. It's a very nice soundtrack to a very nice movie. Is this movie cheesy? Yeah, it's cheesy. But it's not as cheesy as like a lot of the same genre. It is the best of its kind. It is a precedent for everything that followed. It's a baseline by which all other Escape from the Decrepit City movies can be compared, and I would say that those do constitute a subgenre all unto themselves. Like I said, Escape 2000 being a notable example. You might consider that a ripoff, and I would consider it a ripoff to an extent, but there are a lot of other movies with the same or a similar plot and premise to them. This movie was so successful and so good that, people just realized, what if there's a city and it's no laws? And that's basically the premise of, what is it? The Purge. Can't believe I'm talking about the frickin' Purge. Screw the frickin' Purge. That's an implausible scenario. This is a plausible scenario.
I'm back. And I brought some friends. And I'm gonna get that candy bar.
The United States would not make all crime legal in all 50 states for one night. That would never happen. That's balls to the wall insane. That's a stupid premise that makes zero sense. But this movie is just about prison, so it makes sense. And, it's also about institutional racism, like I said. The Duke is a black guy, and he's, there's a point at which they put the president up against the wall, and he's forced to compliment the Duke and say, you're a #1, dog. It's just so much better than The Purge. If you want some social commentary, but you like The Purge, and you want something better than The Purge, something that isn't made by Jason Blum, go for John Carpenter. He's just a better filmmaker. And while the premise of this film is implausible, it's not impossible. It's not The Purge. It's just Escape from New York, and it's a gosh darn fun movie. It just looks great. It really holds up. I guess that said, I'm gonna have to give this sucker 5 stars.
John Carpenter's Escape from New York.
It's not the future we wanted, but the future that happened.
Yeah, just a solid film all around. And that's the trouble with reviewing VHS tapes. Normally I review shows and movies I don't like because they're new or because they're crap, but in this series you're gonna see a lot of positive reviews from me. There just aren't that many old movies I can give 1 or 2 stars, because back in the day movies used to be good and they used to be respectable before the rise of streaming services. And as it happens, the fall of VHS and the rise of streaming services happens just about the same time. I'd put 2008 at the point at which, it's the point at which good movies go out of fashion, trash starts climbing the charts, and people forget about the good stuff that came out on VHS that was really good and really fun and worth watching. So that said, it's difficult to give positive reviews for everything, but hopefully we'll see some stinkers so you can get the trademark Nicholas acerbic criticism that you're used to. It is disturbing, I understand, for many of you to see me being so positive about so many movies, but VHS movies are just good. Sorry. That said, if you liked what you saw, then smash that like button, smash that sub button, smash the whatever button. I got some more fresh content coming your way, more VHS crazy reviews. If you like this series, tell your friends about it. Maybe watch the movie and then watch my review, or vice versa, whatever you want. Those of you with a large VHS collection might have some of the same titles I got, in which case feel free to leave your comments on how watching a film on VHS is substantially different from watching it on a streaming service, or how VHS is a perfectly reasonable format. Just start a discussion. And if you'd like to support these reviews, then write to Nicholas Gate of 1424 Columbine Street, number 1, Denver, Colorado 80206 for some snazzy Nicholas comics. I got some comics coming your way. I got some fresh comics in 2021, so get ready for that. That said, this has been a VHS crazy review of Escape from New York, and I am out. No, that's Moodhurst thing. And so long. 3 years and I still don't have a reasonable sign-off. Sayonara, suckers.